Imagine walking into the Vatican at the end of the 15th century and realizing that the holiest palace in Christendom feels less like a house of God and more like the headquarters of a ruthless, ambitious crime family. That is the world of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name has become shorthand for corruption, lust, and scandal at the very heart of the Church. Tonight, we dive deep into the Vatican's most infamous era, the age of the Borgias, and the scandal that still stains the papal legacy. But to understand why Alexander VI has gone down as perhaps the most notorious pope in history, we have to start long before he put on the papal tiara. Rodrigo Lanzoli de Borja was born in 1431 in the small Spanish town of Xàtiva in the Kingdom of Valencia. He was not born into poverty or obscurity. The Borgia family, later Italianized as Borgia, was a rising noble clan with ambition, connections, and a keen awareness that the quickest way to power in the 15th century was through the Church. Rodrigo's uncle, Alfonso de Borja, rose through the ecclesiastical ranks and, in 1455, became Pope Calixtus III. With that, the Borgia family suddenly had a foothold at the very top. Calixtus III did what many popes of the era did. He practiced nepotism as if it were a duty. He called his relatives to Rome, gave them offices, lands, and benefices. Among them was young Rodrigo, who was brought into the papal court, educated in law and church governance, and gradually molded into one of the Curia's most capable administrators. Rodrigo was talented. He was charming. He had a quick mind and a strong memory. He could read people, negotiate with nobles, and manage money. In a different life, those skills might have made him a successful merchant or diplomat. In Renaissance Rome, they made him dangerous. While still a young man, he was made a cardinal and vice-chancellor of the Church, effectively the chief operating officer of the papal government. He held that office for decades, under multiple popes. In that time, Rodrigo absorbed everything: how money moved through the Church, how alliances were made and broken, how cardinals schemed, how popes juggled kingdoms. He watched Rome fill with artists, bankers, mercenaries, ambassadors. He watched the Church preach humility while its leaders feasted and plotted. He also embraced the worldly pleasures that came with power. The Church insisted on clerical celibacy, but for many high-ranking prelates, that rule was more aspiration than practice. Rodrigo had several mistresses over the years, the most important of whom was Vanozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman. With her, he had 4 children who would become central players in his story: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Chofre. Officially, these were not acknowledged as his sons and daughter. They were attributed to other men on paper. But everyone in Rome understood the truth. Even before he became pope, Borgia's private life was an open secret. This wasn't completely unique. Other cardinals had lovers and children, but Rodrigo's brazen affection for his family and the scale of his ambitions for them would set him apart. By the time Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, Rodrigo was already one of the most powerful and wealthy cardinals in the college. He had held the vice-chancellorship for over 30 years. He knew every passageway of the Vatican, every weakness in the Curia, every cardinal's debts, desires, and grudges, and he wanted the ultimate prize. A papal conclave is supposed to be a sacred event. The cardinals lock themselves in, pray, debate, and eventually elect the man they believe the Holy Spirit has chosen. The conclave of 1492 is remembered, even by the standards of a corrupt age, as one of the most scandalous in history. We'll never know every detail of what happened behind those doors, but contemporary accounts and later testimonies paint an ugly picture. Rodrigo Borgia is said to have used his vast wealth and mastery of patronage to buy votes outright. Gold, jewels, horses, promises of rich offices and bishoprics, even entire palaces were allegedly offered to key cardinals in exchange for their support. Ascanio Sforza, for instance, a powerful member of the Sforza family of Milan, supposedly received the luxurious palace of the vice-chancellor, lucrative abbeys, and fat benefices after throwing his weight behind Borgia. Was every detail of these bribery stories precisely true? Maybe not. Enemies always exaggerate. But the basic fact that Simone, the buying and selling of church offices, saturated that conclave is widely accepted. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI. For some, it was a shock. For others, it seemed like the inevitable triumph of money and cleverness over conscience. The reaction across Christendom was a mix of scandal, resignation, and cynical amusement. People had long known the papacy was entangled in earthly politics. But to many, Alexander VI symbolized a new low, a pope whose spiritual authority rested visibly on the foundation of a bought election and an openly worldly life. Yet we should not imagine Alexander VI simply slouching across the papal throne, twirling his fingers and thinking only of sin. He was a shrewd politician with a clear agenda. Much of that agenda revolved around one thing: his family. From the moment he became pope, Alexander VI began positioning his children as if they were the princes and princesses of a royal dynasty. Juan was made Duke of Gandia. Geoffrey was married to Sanchia of Aragon, connecting the Borgias to the royal family of Naples. Lucrezia, his beloved daughter, became a diplomatic chess piece, engaged and married 3 times to secure alliances with powerful Italian houses. Cesare, at first, was forced into the church. He became a cardinal at around 18, far more interested in swords than sermons. Under Alexander's watch, the Vatican turned into a family palace. The Pope had new apartments built, the Borgia apartments, decorated with lavish frescoes by artists like Pinturicchio, which mixed biblical scenes with mythological and astrological imagery. Visitors commented on the luxury of his court, the abundance of feasts, banquets, and entertainments. His charisma was undeniable. Ambassadors wrote about his presence, his capacity to charm, his ability to make each person in front of him feel important. But behind the charm was unashamed nepotism. Alexander VI gave offices, lands, and incomes to relatives and allies with breathtaking speed. Church property became fuel for Borgia patronage networks. To his enemies, this wasn't just immoral. It was a hijacking of the church's mission. As if that weren't enough, Alexander's other relationships added another layer of scandal. After his connection with Vannozza cooled, he took another famous mistress, Giulia Farnese, a young Roman noblewoman known as Giulia la Bella, Giulia the Beautiful. She was married off to Orsino Orsini, tying her to a powerful family, but she spent much of her time near the Pope. Giulia's brother, Alessandro Farnese, was soon made a cardinal. His detractors sneered that he owed his red hat to his sister's position in the papal bed and nicknamed him Cardinal Petticoat. Ironically, that same Alessandro Farnese would one day become Pope Paul III, the pope who opened the Council of Trent and spearheaded major reforms in response to the Protestant Reformation. History loves irony, and the Borgia story is full of it. Still, it wasn't just family life and love affairs that stained Alexander VI's papacy. The Borgias existed in a wider context, the brutal, treacherous world of Renaissance Italian politics. Italy at the time was not a unified country but a patchwork of rival powers: the Republic of Florence, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, the Republic of Venice, the Papal States, and many smaller city-states and principalities. Intrigue, assassinations, shifting alliances, and wars were everyday instruments of statecraft. In that world, the Pope was not just a spiritual leader, he was also a temporal ruler of central Italian territories. Alexander II understood that to survive and to elevate his family, he had to play the game as ruthlessly as any secular prince. He used excommunications, marriages, condottieri, mercenary generals, and alliances with France and Spain to shape the map. Cesare Borgia became his sharpest weapon. When Cesare cast off his cardinal's robes and took up the sword, the Pope followed suit by showering him with titles, backing him with papal treasury funds, and legitimizing his conquests in the name of restoring order to the papal states. Cesare carved out a principality in the Romagna region, taking cities like Forlì, Imola, Rimini, and Faenza. Chroniclers described him as terrifying and magnetic, willing to lie, bribe, and kill without flinching. Machiavelli, who observed him while on a diplomatic mission, would later use Cesare as a model of the effective but unscrupulous prince in his famous work, The Prince. Under Cesare's steel, rebel lords were lured into meetings under safe conduct and then executed. Enemies were strangled, thrown from windows, or simply vanished in the night. To Alexander and Cesare, this was justified. Chaotic local tyrannies were being replaced with stronger centralized rule. To many Italians, it looked like the church openly sponsoring bloodshed for the sake of Borgia power. Inside the Vatican, all of this fed the perception of a perverse court. The most infamous story, the event that has come to symbolize Borgia depravity, is the so-called Banquet of the Chestnuts. The account comes from the diary of Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, who recorded in detail the rituals and happenings of the papal court. According to the widely circulated version of the story, on October 30th, 1501, Alexander VI hosted a banquet in his apartments, attended by his son Cesare, his daughter Lucrezia, and 50 courtesans. After dinner, the women allegedly danced, and then, when chestnuts were scattered on the floor, crawled to pick them up while the Pope and his son looked on. Prizes were said to be given to those men who performed the most sexual acts with the women. The picture is lurid. A pope presiding over a lewd show in the papal palace. Modern historians debate how literally we should take this tale. Was it distorted by later copyists? Was it propaganda inserted into Burchard's chronicle? Or did something like this actually occur, perhaps slightly less outrageous than the legends claim? We may never know. But whether exaggerated or not, the Banquet of the Chestnuts gained such traction because it aligned perfectly with how Alexander VI's critics already saw him, as a man whose Vatican had become a theater of perversion. Lucrezia Borgia herself became a lightning rod for all the dark fantasies about the Borgia court. In reality, much of her life was shaped by the ambitions of her father and brother. She was married 3 times, first to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, then to Alfonso of Aragon, an illegitimate son of the King of Naples, and finally to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. These marriages cemented alliances. They were political acts, not love stories. Yet rumors grew that she was more than just a victim. Enemies whispered that she was her father's mistress, then Cesare's lover, that she had a special ring containing poison which she used on rivals, that she presided over orgies in the Vatican. Real evidence for incest or poison rings is thin to non-existent. These stories likely say more about the misogyny and sensationalism of the time than about Lucrezia herself. But in the public imagination, the facts hardly mattered. The mythic Lucrezia, seductive, deadly, incestuous, was too compelling to resist. Outside Rome, figures like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence thundered against the corruption of Rome. Savonarola was a Dominican friar who, in the 1490s, preached fiery sermons denouncing vanity, vice, and the moral decay of both Florence and the Church. He saw the invasion of Italy by the French King Charles VIII as God's judgment on a sinful land. When Alexander VI tried to reel Savonarola in by offering him a cardinal's hat, effectively a bribe of honor, Savonarola refused. He denounced the Borgia Pope as illegitimate and prophesied divine punishment. Alexander excommunicated him. Eventually, Savonarola was arrested by Florentine authorities, tried and executed, hanged and burned in Florence's main square. To Savonarola's followers and later reformers, his clash with Alexander VI became a symbol, the righteous prophet crushed by a corrupt church. That image would linger long after both men were gone. Meanwhile, Alexander VI was doing more than just waging wars and managing scandals at home. He was also reaching into the newly discovered world. After Columbus's voyage in 1492, Spain and Portugal clashed over who had the right to claim the lands across the ocean. As a Spanish pope with close ties to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, Alexander VI intervened. Through a series of bulls, he essentially drew a line across the globe, giving Spain rights to lands west of it and Portugal to lands east, a division later refined in the Treaty of Tordesillas. It is astonishing to think the same man accused of hosting orgies in the papal apartments was also making decisions that would shape the colonization of the Americas, the fate of indigenous peoples, and the global balance of power for centuries. Spiritual authority, moral scandal, and geopolitical power were all tangled in one figure. Inside the Vatican, the day-to-day atmosphere during Alexander's reign reflected that contradiction. On one hand, there were solemn liturgies, rituals, and prayers. The Pope celebrated Mass, received pilgrims, approved new religious orders, and participated in the spiritual life of the Church. On the other hand, the corridors of the Apostolic Palace hummed with gossip, bargaining, and fear. Cardinals sought favor or plotted resistance. Ambassadors sent letters home dripping with tales of Borgia excesses. Servants and courtiers traded whispered stories of poisoning, secret tunnels, and hidden lovers. One story that captured the dark imagination of the time was the idea of the Borgias as master poisoners. According to legend, they used a substance called la cantarella, a slow-acting poison supposedly derived from arsenic, to eliminate enemies and seize their property. Dinner invitations from the Borgias, the story went, were as dangerous as battles. In reality, some of the alleged victims of Borgia poison may have died of disease, stress, or simple misfortune. Renaissance Italy was full of plots and poisonings, and not all of them belonged to one family. But the Borgias were such perfect villains in the public mind that any mysterious death associated with them became another brick in their reputation for perversion and murder. Even within the family, tragedy and suspicion struck. In June 1497, Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia and Alexander's favorite son, disappeared after a dinner in Rome. His body was later found in the Tiber River with multiple stab wounds. The murder was never officially solved. Some blamed rival nobles. Others pointed the finger at Cesare, who may have resented Juan's secular titles and their father's favoritism. Alexander VI was reportedly devastated, weeping openly, shutting himself away in grief, talking of repentance and reform. For a brief period, he seemed genuinely shaken, commissioning inquiries into church abuses and speaking of changing his ways. But grief and guilt faded. The machine of power rolled on. If anything, Juan's death cleared the way for Cesare to assume the role of secular leader of the Borgia project. As the years passed, Alexander grew older, but his hunger to secure a lasting Borgia presence did not diminish. Cesare's campaigns continued. Lucrezia's marriages evolved from scandalous Roman gossip to relative stability as Duchess of Ferrara. She reinvented herself there as a patron of the arts and a respected noblewoman, even as her name remained synonymous with sin in popular imagination. And then, in 1503, everything collapsed. That summer, Alexander Sixtus and Cesare attended a banquet at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. Shortly afterward, both father and son fell violently ill. Fevers, vomiting, weakness, the symptoms were severe. Rome buzzed with rumors. The Borgias had tried to poison a cardinal's wine, only to drink the poisoned bottle themselves by mistake. The cardinal had poisoned them in a daring act of revenge, or, more prosaically, they had simply contracted malaria in the mosquito-infested lowlands around Rome. Most modern historians lean toward disease rather than poison. Malaria was rampant, and many people fell sick in the same period. Whatever the cause, Alexander's condition deteriorated quickly. Witnesses described his body swelling, his skin turning dark, his features grotesquely altered by death. In a city already inclined to see divine judgment in physical decay, this horrifying corpse was taken as a sign, the outward reflection of inward corruption. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. Cesare, younger and stronger, eventually recovered from his illness, but he was never again the force he had been. In the immediate chaos after Alexander's death, Rome erupted. Families that had been suppressed by Borgia power took revenge. Houses were sacked, Borgia supporters fled or went to ground. The Vatican, for a brief time, was almost abandoned as people scrambled to grab what they could: power, property, safety, before the next pope changed everything. With the Borgia patriarch gone, Cesare's political position crumbled. He had built his entire secular power on papal backing, papal money, and papal legitimacy. Without Alexander, enemies he had made across Italy closed in. The next pope, Pius III, reigned only a few weeks. His successor, Julius II, from the Della Rovere family, long-standing Borgia rivals, was determined to dismantle Cesare's network. Julius stripped him of titles, took back Borgia-controlled cities into papal hands, and eventually had Cesare arrested. Cesare was sent to Spain, escaped, and ended up dying in 1507 during a minor skirmish in Navarre, far from the grand stage on which he had once tried to build an empire. Lucrezia, in Ferrara, lived on until 1519, becoming a much-loved duchess, supporting literature and music, bearing children, and cultivating a reputation for piety that stood in sharp contrast to the monstrous image that persisted elsewhere. With the central players gone or scattered, the Borgia saga shifted from lived experience to legend, and what a legend it became. Over the next centuries, the Borgias appeared in pamphlets, histories, plays, novels, and, much later, films and television series as the ultimate corrupt family. Alexander the Second was imagined as a lecherous old man, constantly surrounded by courtesans and feasts, poisoning rivals between masses. Cesare became the archetype of the charismatic, dangerous prince. Lucrezia was cast as a murderous seductress. The Vatican during their time was painted as a den of vice where the Pope's apartments were used for orgies and secret killings. Medieval and early modern Protestant writers, eager to portray the papacy as the whore of Babylon, seized on the Borgias as proof that the Roman Church was irredeemably corrupt. The Reformation, that began a decade after Alexander's death, did not emerge solely because of him, of course. Complex theological, social, and political factors were at play. But the memory of popes like Alexander the Second made it much easier for reformers like Luther to argue that the institution had lost its way. At the same time, Catholic defenders were often uncomfortable discussing Alexander's papacy in any detail. It was easier to focus on later reforming popes than to linger on an era that seemed to confirm every accusation. Modern historians, working with more critical methods, have tried to peel away the layers of myth and propaganda. They point out that not every shocking story about the Borgias is reliable. Some tales, like the Banquet of the Chestnuts, may have been exaggerated or added later. The incest accusations against Lucrezia are incredibly shaky. The idea of a proprietary Borgia poison used in dozens of murders is likely overblown. They remind us that the Borgias had powerful enemies, families like the Della Rovere, Colonna, Orsini, and others, who had every incentive to produce and circulate damaging rumors. Yet, even after stripping away the more sensational fabrications, Alexander VI's record remains deeply troubling. He used simony to become pope. He showered his illegitimate children with church offices and wealth. He used spiritual tools like excommunications and indulgences as weapons in secular politics. He backed and benefited from the violent campaigns of Cesare. He turned the papal court into a place where family dinners and diplomatic meetings, masses and masked balls, mixed in a way that blurred the line between sacred and profane. What makes his scandal so perverse and why it still grips us isn't just the sex and poison, though those details make for vivid storytelling. It's the location. All of this happened not in some petty noble's castle, but in the Vatican, the heart of an institution that claimed moral authority over millions of souls. A pope could be a flawed man. Many popes before and after Alexander were ambitious, worldly, even cruel. But Alexander VI seemed to embody the extreme version of that contradiction. A man who could preside over Mass in St. Peter's in the morning and turn around to plan his son's next war in the afternoon, who could issue bulls partitioning the globe while ordering offices handed to his mistress's brother, who preached Christ while practicing power politics without visible shame. It forces us to confront a discomforting truth. Institutions, even sacred ones, are only as pure as the people who run them. The office of the Pope may be, in Catholic theology, a holy one, but the man who occupies it is still a human being, vulnerable to greed, lust, fear, and love. Alexander VI did not invent church corruption, but he made it impossible to ignore. His papacy became a cautionary tale, one that, consciously or not, helped lay the groundwork for later reforms within Catholicism. The Council of Trent, the stricter, more disciplined papacy of later centuries, the insistence on clerical celibacy and moral behavior, all these can be seen in part as reactions to an era in which a family like the Borgias could turn the Vatican into something shockingly like a Renaissance princely court. And so when we talk about the Vatican's most perverse scandal and the shame of the Borgias, we are not just trading in lurid anecdotes, we are looking at a critical moment where the gap between what the Church claimed to be and what it actually was became too wide and too visible to hide. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, is at the center of that gap. He was brilliant, charismatic, politically gifted, and wholly at ease mixing the sacred and the profane. He loved his children fiercely and would do almost anything for them. He ruled in a violent, treacherous time and played by its rules. But because he did all of this from the throne of St. Peter, his personal sins and political choices became the Church's shame. 500 years later, the name Borgia still tastes of poison in the mouth of history. Whether every rumor is true or not, the broad outline is clear. This was a papacy in which ambition and appetite, family and faith, collided in a way the Vatican has rarely seen before or since. And that is why, even now, when people look up at the majestic ceilings of the Vatican or watch white smoke rise from the Sistine Chapel, the shadow of Alexander VI sometimes lingers in the back of their minds, a reminder that even in the holiest of halls, humans can fall astonishingly, catastrophically short of the ideals they claim to serve.